This watercolor tutorial will show you how to get good results from sponging. Most of this painting is sponging because most of this painting is going to be the trees. You're going to be drawing just the biggest main trees and the main parts of the trees. There's no need to draw all of the really small branches. You'll be using a large 2-inch flat. You're also going to be using a number 10 round. You're going to be using a number 2 and a number 6 round, a very fine liner, and a number 1 rigger. You'll be using a sea sponge for your sponging. You're going to be using table salt, and you're also going to be using Misket, which is the masking agent that we're going to be using to keep some of those bigger trees nice and clean. You're going to be using cerulean blue. If you don't want to use cerulean and you would rather use ultramarine, that's fine, because it's going to be very watered down anyway. You're going to be using sap green for the trees. You're going to be using burnt sienna. You'll be using burnt umber as well for the tree trunks. You're also going to be using a little bit of black. We're going to be using some cadmium red, just a very little bit to mix with our cadmium yellow to make some orangey color. So some cad red, a little bit of cadmium yellow, and then at the very end, we're going to be using our Chinese white. You want to make sure that you just misket out some of the biggest trunks and branches that you want to keep nice and clean. You don't have to do all of the smaller branches, just the bigger branches that you want to keep nice and clean and not have sponging over them. The majority of the branches will have sponging over them. We're going to begin with a nice wash over the entire paper of watered down cerulean or your watered down ultramarine, whichever it is that you prefer. We're doing the whole paper because we want to both get the sky and the water with that really light glaze for right now. So a nice wash, nice wet wash of your watered down blue. Once you're all done with that nice wash, you want to just leave it sit for a minute, lift your paper, wipe off your table so you don't get any washback of paint that you got on your table, and we're going to move down to the water section. For the water section, you want your sky to be dry and at least close to the water line, and we're going to just add a tiny little bit of your blue back in, a more intense little bit of blue at the water line, water horizon line, because that's going to just separate out that sky area a little bit. Just a little thin line, let it bleed. If it doesn't want to bleed, add a little bit of water to it, and then we're going to just salt that water area. Want to make it look like it's going to be glistening in the sun. So just a little bit of salt right at that area. Now is a good time to let things dry and watch the entire video before you come back to do the rest of your painting. Now on a separate sheet of paper, I'm going to just show you how we're going to do those trees across the way on the other side of the water. And I'm doing it on a separate sheet of paper just because there's already so many lines in that on the painting. I don't want to confuse the issue. So that big section of trees, I'm just putting on a nice wet wash of sap green right at the water line, and then I'm going to extend it all the way over. After I put that wash down, I'm going to go ahead and dry brush the top off to give it a very uneven look for the tree growth. While it's still nice and wet, I'm going to be adding in a little bit of sienna because I want it to look like fall trees. If you would rather keep it looking like summer, then you do not have to put in any additional colors. However, you could put in a little bit more intense sap green if you would like. Once my sienna is in, I'm going to put a little bit of black right at the water line because that's going to help to give me some depth in my trees and make it look like there's dimension to the trees, that they're not flat. And then after I put my black in, I'm going to salt that because that's going to give me a little bit of texturing, which is all I will need because it's across the lake. I don't need a whole lot of detail. I'm going to do the same thing as I extend that thinner part of the trees across the lake. I'm just putting a thin line of sap down. I'm going to do the same thing as far as dry brushing the edge off, but I'm not going to extend it up very far because this is a much thinner line of trees. If you want to put any of your sienna in, you can. And of course, I'm going to put in a little bit of black with a much thinner brush down at the water line. I'll also put on a little bit of salt for this. You want to use a much thinner brush for your black because you don't want big areas of black on this thin section of tree. So I'm using a much littler brush, my little liner. And this is what you'll do, of course, on your bigger picture, but it's easier for you to see on this nice little drawing here. Now I'm going to do the same thing on a separate sheet of paper for you for your sponging of your trees because it can get very confusing if you're on a really big sheet of paper. When you use your sponge, you want to get a nice amount of watered paint on your sponge, and you want to lightly dab your sponge to your paper and turn your sponge in all directions as you're going so that you don't have that same imprint everywhere. What you don't want to do is just slam that sponge down because then you will get no little white spots in between. You'll just get big globs of color on your paper, which again is not what you want. So you want to move that sponge around and get a lot of little sections in between. Then I'm taking my bigger brush. It doesn't necessarily have to be your big flat, but that works for me. And I'm putting in some more intense color here and there while it's wet so that that intense color can move through the lighter wet parts. Don't cover up all of your white holes that you created with your sponge, and then you're going to pull out the edges all along where you've added your dark with your little liner, kind of squiggling that paint around to give it a really rough edge and make it look like foliage. You don't have to do that on every sponged area. You want to pick some sections out where you want it to be more intense. Those would be the sections that you want it to be denser. Then I'm dropping in a little bit of black, just a small amount, to again increase the density of the foliage. It will make it look like the foliage is more dense, causing some shadowed sections of the foliage where it's in multiple layers. After I put in that little bit of black and pull out the edges, then I'm going to throw on some salt. You want to do this in sections. Do not try to do the entire whole tree section at one time. Do it in sections. It is perfectly fine to have hard edges on this because it's rough foliage, so it doesn't matter. And then once you've done it in sections, your whole tree area will be nice and covered in with holes. You'll see some different intensities of the green. You'll see a little bit of that black that has now kind of softened itself into the green. You want to make sure, again, that you do it in sections. You pull out all of those little sections, and then once it's dry, you can go back in and use a more intense green or even a sienna and green or straight sienna to sponge in some areas that you want to be more in the forefront of your painting. Don't cover up all of your light greens that you already have put down. You want to leave some of that, shine through, because again, you want different intensities on this. And be sure that when you are sponging, you're sponging nice and lightly, so you're just getting the tips of the sponge to be hitting your paper. I'm filling in some of the more intense, solid colors with a brush because it's too hard to do that, of course, with your sponge. And once I've finished that, throw on a little bit of salt, and then you can look at your painting and see where there might be some sections that you want to make more solid, not a lot of holes from the sponge. Those sections then just fill in with your brush. Don't get carried away. There should just be a few of those sections because the holes between your leaves is what adds to the interest of your picture. Along the edge of those solid spots, I added a little bit more black to show some depth into those spots because that's pushing my leaves and my sections of tree back to bring others forward. Now you can go back in and with your little small brush, your little liner, you can fill in some areas, pull out some little squiggle lines from the edges of your leaves to just show a little bit more detail to all of these branches and leaves. It's just going to add to the reality of how you want your foliage to look. You don't want it to be all just sponged sections. You do want to have some of that real fine foliage, those real skinny little leaves hanging down. Pick your areas where you want that to be. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but along the edges, when you pull out those little fine details, it will make a difference. Now I'm still nice and wet everywhere, so now I'm going to go in and add in some nice wet sienna to just a few spots to give it the impression that those leaves are starting to turn color. I'm picking out the areas that I want because I don't want my tree to look like it has polka dots. I want to specifically pick out sections where it will draw my eye to. Maybe along the tops of some sections of leaves or on the edges, but you want to be specific as to where you want it. Less is better. You can always go back in and add, but again, it's hard to take out. So pick your areas carefully. Once you've put in your sienna color, if you wanted to do that, of course you don't have to, but if you wanted to do that, then I'm going to go back in and fill in some of the areas of green that I want to be more solid in between my tree trunks. Again, it doesn't have to be everywhere because there could be just some areas where you see through the tree trunks and it's not all totally filled in with your sap green. But there are some areas that I want to be nice and solid. I'll fill those in. I'll add a little bit of black if I need to, or a little bit of sienna. You can even put in a little bit of sienna. I'm going to dry brush the edges off to make it look nice and rough. And then I'll throw on a little bit of salt to those areas also. Again, this is all things that if you want to do it. If you don't want that, you don't have to. If you want to use your sponging to sponge off the edges instead of dry brushing, you can do that too. But just plan it ahead so that you kind of have an idea of what you want to do instead of getting your paint down and then trying to figure out what you want. Now I'm going to paint in my log that is in the lower left, and I'm using a nice sienna color for that first. Just a very light wash of sienna for right now, and then I'm going to allow that to dry before I move on because I don't want any other colors down there to bleed into that log. So I'm going to just go ahead and put a light wash on, and then I'm going to allow that to dry. While it's still wet, I'm adding just a thin line of black along the base of that log to act as a shadow while it's wet, because then I'll get a nice soft bleed that will give me a more realistic shadow on that log. Now I'm going to move back up to my water, and I'm going to put on another lightish wash of my blue along the tree line and bring it forward into the lake. I'm going to it's going to be solid, but I'm going to dry brush off the edge of it because I don't want it to be solid the whole way coming towards me. So I'm putting it on a little bit more solid at the actual tree line, but then giving it a dry brushed look as I come forward. And then I'm going to be throwing on a little bit of salt. Again, I want to show some ripples in the water, and rather than having to paint those in, the salting will do that for me. Now my tree area is somewhat dry, so I'm going to go back in now and I'm going to paint in all of the dirt areas. Not the tree trunks yet, I'm just painting in all of the dirt areas around my tree trunks and extending that dirt area out into the water. I'm just using burnt umber for this, straight burnt umber. It's a little bit intense, but I want it to be because I'm going to be salting this, and if I make it too light, my salting isn't going to do what I want it to do, which I want to show the roughness of the dirt with just one wash of paint and a little bit of salting. I've dry brushed it out into the water, so it really looks like an area where the water and the dirt kind of hit. There's no drop off. And after I'm done with that wash of burnt umber, I'm going to get a little bit of black and just along the roots of the trees and maybe under some of the miscuted area that will be foliage, I'm going to add in just a little bit of watered down black just to give it some shadowed effect so that I don't have to go back in and do that. If I put it in now while it's nice and wet, it's going to have a softer blend and a more realistic look to it than if I have to put it in when it's dry and then water off the edges. So I'm going to put in just a little bit of black here and there just to, again, show some natural shadowing around the bottoms of my trees and under my bush. Lastly, you're going to put on some salt because you want that salt to make all of that ground look like dried leaves or stones, but you want it to be nice and rough looking. Now I'm going to be putting in the reflections in the water from the trees above. And if you look at your picture, it will show you exactly where to put those. It's straight lines of either dry brushing, or you can just manually zigzag your coloring all the way down. You don't want to start at the tree line, okay? The first little bit of reflection is from the little section of land over to the other little section of land. So look at your picture. It'll show you exactly where you want to do this. I just used some watered down black and a little bit of sap because you want to have a little bit of that sappy color, but more black than sap. You can either dry brush that line from side to side, or you can just manually paint it from little lines horizontally from side to side. You don't want to start all the way up at the tree line, so you want to leave yourself some space that would be that lake all the way to the other side. So you want to start about midway where that branch is hanging down. Okay, so plan that so you don't get carried away. Draw in or paint in your line so you know where you're going to start from, and then decide you want to bring those lines straight down. They're not at an angle, they are straight down from where you begin to where you end. And you are going to be ending at the edge of your paper, so you're bringing it the whole way down. When you get your original lines put in, before it dries, I went back in and dropped in along the center of where I painted a little bit of more intense black, just so that my lines, the edges of my lines would be a little bit lighter than the center. Now your reflective lines will go out farther to the right also, but not as many and not as close together, because the lines on the far right in the water are just reflections of the tree branches hanging over much farther up. So they're not as intense because they are not as full and as close to the water as the lower branches. So you're going to put some in, but not nearly as much and not nearly as intense. Now looking at my picture, I'm going to pick out a couple areas that I want to fill in with some additional color. And I'm just using a very light yellow mixed with a tiny little bit of sap to kind of take away from all of that same sappy green color, and pulling out this yellowish green, or I don't know. I call it a yellow green, but it's probably more of a amber color. But I'm adding that here and there just to take away from all of those solid greens. And I'm putting it in some of the sections that are the holes. I'm not putting it really over any of my sap colors. I'm filling in some of my holes caused by the sponging. If you don't want to put this part in, if you like what you have already, then just leave it alone. But if you'd like to add some in the holes, then you can pick out some of those sections that you want to put them in, put that color in and paint it in. But make it consistent, meaning if you put that color in the middle of your trees, it should go pretty much the whole way across, or at least in a section. It's not just going to be one little tiny area, because what you're putting this color in for is you're looking at trees behind these green trees, and they have to be a little bit more in depth or wider than just a little splot. So you want to pick out a section and then carry that section all the way through. Now, once you're happy with all of your coloring and your trees, then we're going to take the misket off. Do not take the misket off until you are happy with everything, because you can't put it back on, exactly where you had it before. So you want to make sure that you just take it off when you are ready. And you don't have to take it all off at the same time. You can take off a little bit at a time. But take off your misket, because now we're going to be painting in the tree trunks. I found it much easier to paint them in one tree at a time. One tree almost totally done, and then moved on to another tree. So I painted in my biggest part of my trunk first. I used some burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black. I'm going to salt the biggest part of the trunk. And then as I move up the tree and my tree trunk and branches get thinner, I didn't have to salt those. You're only salting the biggest sections, because that's the sections that you would see a little bit of texture on. You're not going to see texturing way up in the trees on the thinner branches. I did one tree at a time. I don't want them all to bleed together. And I left a couple little holes here and there, which I will fill in later then with green to make it look like those branches have grown in front of the trunks. Once I got those all filled in, I threw a little bit of salt on those big trunks, not the little branches, the little tiny branches, but I did paint one tree at a time. I took that big, nice, thick tree trunk all the way up to where I would want it to be. And then when I was done using my bigger brush, because my trunk's getting thinner, I reverted to a thinner brush. I used my number one rigger for quite a few of my branches. Only on the biggest part of the trunk, on the left side of all the biggest part of my trunks, while it was wet, I added in a little bit of black for some shadowing. And then again, I just extended that trunk all the way up to however high I wanted it to be. It doesn't have to be a solid line. You can have it as a dotted trunk, leave some of the green, because then what that shows is that greenery is growing in front of the trunk. You don't have to have a solid trunk the whole way up. Plan it that way. Don't paint the whole thing as one solid trunk the whole way up, as one solid branch the whole way out. You want to leave some green, because that's where the foliage is visible in front of the trunk, and it's hiding the trunks or the branches. I moved over to a tree trunk farther away from the first one. Again, just simply because I didn't want to do wet on wet. I don't want them to all blend together. But I am doing one whole tree trunk at a time. One whole tree trunk and some bigger branches at a time. Then I can go back in and add all of the finer branches. It will also keep you from getting frustrated trying to get all of these little tiny branches in, and because you don't want to have such a mishmash of branches that you don't see the foliage anymore. You want to do one tree at a time. Don't overwhelm your trees with little branches. All of those little branches can certainly be added at any time. Again, less is better. You can always add, but if you put so many branches in, little tiny branches, that you're covering all of your pretty foliage, then you've defeated the purpose of this painting, which is to show all of the nice foliage of these beautiful trees. Move your paper around to paint. You don't have to have your painting all vertical. You can move it around to be horizontal, move it around to be painting towards you or away from you. That's one of the reasons why my personal preference is not to tape my paper down, so that I can move it in all directions. It just is my personal preference, but I find it easier to paint that way so that it's not stuck to a table that I can't move anything or stuck to a board. It just works for me. Now, once you have most of your bigger branches painted, you can go in and start doing some smaller branches. You want to connect those smaller branches to all of the foliage. So if you have a big sponged area of foliage, you have to substantiate that with branches. All of that foliage isn't just growing out of the air. So if you have a nice sponged area, take some branches out into that area. Again, You can leave some of that foliage. You don't have to have a solid branch all the way through it. It can go through it in sections. I used both my number 2 round, my number 1 rigger, and my little fine liner, because you want to have some of those nice little fine branches too, because that's where the edges of those little tiny foliage leaves come from. So look at your branch before you try to put too much or too little branches to it. You have to have some branches out into that foliage. The foliage is not hanging in the air. It has to come off of something. I did one branch at a time. Again, less is better. You can always go back in and add, but it's very difficult to take off. If you are getting tired or if you are getting frustrated in any way, walk away from this for a while. You don't have to complete this in one sitting. You can work on it in a couple hours or a couple days or a couple weeks. There's no reason that you have to finish it in any specific amount of time, unless, of course, you're very impatient. But then, if you are, you should still walk away from it so that you don't overdo. It's always better to do less because you can add to it. Now, along with your little branches and your very fine little branches, there's also trees that are going into the distance. So not all of these big tree trunks are the only trees in the picture. If you look at your picture, you'll see a lot of very fine, thinner trees in between these bigger trunks. You can put those in just with your rigger. They don't have to be solid. They can, again, be like a dotted line so that looks like there's foliage growing in front of those trees. And they can go all the way to the top of your picture. They can go off to the right. They can go off to the left. They can go behind some of your bigger trunks. They can go in front of some of your bigger trunks. But again, you want to plan how that goes. So do one at a time, decide where you want those to be, and then you can go ahead and put those in. You're going to go ahead and continue to do all of your tree trunks Again, I did mine one at a time. It was just easier for me to do it that way. That way I could plan that if I wanted it in front of another tree or behind another tree, I wasn't confused as to how to do that, and my branches didn't run all together. So do one tree at a time. It really is the best way to do it. It might not sound like it is, and you might want to just paint everything white brown, but if you work wet against dry, then you'll have those separations of the trees and it'll make it look much better in the end. Now moving down towards the ground to those broken branches laying on the ground, I'm painting those in with a watered down umber first. And then after I paint those in with the watered down umber and they dry, I'm going over a couple of them with a wash of umber mixed with black so that it looks like there's different branches in that pile. There's some that are older, some might be from a different tree, but it just makes them look like they're different branches. So I'm just using plain umber first, and then I'm going, when that dries, then I'm going back over a couple of them with an umber and black wash. Water that down. It doesn't have to be real intensely dark. Now I'm going to be finishing up all of my trees, again, one tree at a time. This painting took me about 5 hours, 6 hours to do. Now I know you're saying, oh my gosh, that's all? I've been doing it a very long time, but I didn't do that all at one time. I did an hour, the next day I did an hour and a half, the next day I did 2 hours. I didn't try to finish it all at one time. That way it gave my painting a good opportunity to dry. I could remove salt when I needed to. I could look at it from a different perspective because now I've been away from it for a day, and that helps. Unless you are on a specific time frame, you don't have to get this all done at one time. That's what's great about watercolor. You can come back to it anytime. But now I want to finish up all of my trees, get all of my little branches done so that I can move into doing my finishing touches. Make sure that you get some of your little branches coming downward too. Not all of your branches should just be from left to right. There's some that come down at an angle, or they could even come straight down, but that's what adds to the interest of your picture. So you want to make sure that you have branches that are not just all from left to right. Now, when I'm all done with everything and I really like my trees and everything is good, I'm going to take off my little biscuit dot, which is my sun. Okay, if you already have taken it off, that's fine. Just hopefully you didn't paint it in. But I am taking off my little dot that's the sun. I'm removing any salt that might be in that area. I want to make sure everything is really dry in that area, because to put the sun in, I have to put a wash of plain water all the way around my sun dot. Just about an inch all the way around, because in that wetness, I want my color, my white color, to kind of bleed out so that I don't have just a perfect white dot. So after I have wet it, and about, like I said, an inch all the way around my white dot, I'm going to use my Chinese white, nice and intense, because if you don't, it will dry and you won't even be able to see it. And I am painting around my white dot with a little line of my Chinese white, and I'm allowing it to bleed in that water. Okay, it's not going to go too far because I only wet about an inch all the way around, and it will dry a little bit lighter. But while it is nice and wet, I mixed a little bit of my red and a little bit of my cad yellow, and with my fine liner, my little brush, I'm going to make little dots along that edge, because I want that white dot to look like it's white in the middle and then it shoots off that sun color along the edges. So just along the edge, I'm putting in that nice orange color, and that orange color is pretty intense. It's not too pale. And then right in the center, I'll put another little dot of white, pull out some of those little white lines to make it look like sun streaks, and then just leave it alone to dry. We're going to go back in once it's dry and put in another little white dot right in the center with some Chinese white. But we cannot do that until it's dry. Now, while I'm waiting for that to dry to make sure I'm happy with it, and while I'm using my Chinese white, I'm going to go back down to my water, to my tree reflection in my water. I got a little bit heavy-handed with my reflections, and if you did, and my lines were too solid, I'm going to go ahead in and break up some of those lines with my Chinese white. I just got a little bit too solid, and that's perfectly fine if you did, because now you can go back in and break up your solid, darker, reflective lines with a little bit of Chinese white. If you're happy with your reflections, then please leave it alone. But there is a way to fix it if you got too heavy-handed. Once your sun is totally dry, and if you are happy with it, leave it alone. But if you want to put in another little white dot to make it more evident and more intense, you can do so, but it needs to be totally dry before you do that. And once that's done, you're done. Great painting. I hope you know now how to do nice leafy trees. Sponging is fun, but it can be overwhelming. But either way, happy painting.